The biting wind whipped across the tarmac, carrying the scent of jet fuel and the distant, arrogant roar of engines. Alara adjusted the collar of her maintenance overalls, the rough fabric of familiar chafe against her neck. They said the airbase was a place of opportunity, a fresh start. For her, it felt like a cage, meticulously constructed from regulations and the condescending smiles of younger men who mistook her silence for incompetence. She'd requested a transfer to active flight status, specifically for the new XR-9 Wraith program. The request had been met with a polite but firm redirection to ground crew logistics. Her hands, they implied, were better suited to a wrench than a joystick, despite the pristine, almost unnerving stillness they possessed. The Wraith, a sleek shard of obsidian metal, sat in its climate-controlled hangar like a slumbering god, accessible only to the chosen. And she, it was clear, was not among them. Colonel Graves, the base commander, was a man carved from granite and skepticism. He glanced at her file, a thin document scrubbed clean of anything truly illuminating, and seen only a woman of a certain age, seeking a thrill perhaps, or a way to recapture lost youth. His briefing to the new intake of pilots had been laced with warnings about the Wraith's unforgiving nature. "She demands perfection," he'd said, his gaze sweeping over the eager, mostly male faces, completely bypassing Alara where she stood near the back, observing, always observing. "She will expose any weakness, any hesitation. Only the best will tame her." Ilara had felt the familiar tightening in her chest, not of anger, but of a deeply buried sorrow. Taming was not the word. Understanding, perhaps. Partnership. Instructor Maddox, a pilot whose own career had plateaued just shy of the Wraith program, seemed to take a particular, subtle pleasure in her exclusion. During simulator sessions, mandatory even for ground crew familiarization, he would hover. "Careful there, ma'am." He'd drawl if her simulated landing was a hair off the designated millimeter, even though it was still well within acceptable parameters for a trainee. These things aren't as forgiving as a cargo hauler. He never knew how close she came to demonstrating just what a cargo hauler could do in the right hands. Or what those hands had once done with machines, far less forgiving than any simulator. Her responses were always brief, measured. "Understood, sir." The discipline, ingrained over years of unspeakable pressure, held. It was a shield and a prison. The younger officers, like Lieutenant Davies, barely out of flight school and already brimming with the unearned confidence of his rank, saw her as a fixture, like the coffee machine or the outdated motivational posters. He'd once asked her, with genuine unthinking condescension, if she needed help lifting a supply crate, a crate she could have probably bench-pressed with him still in it. She'd simply picked it up, her movements economical and precise, and carried on. The only ones who seemed to see anything beyond the surface were a few of the low-ranking airmen, the ones who spent their days elbow-deep in grease and wiring, the ones who recognized the quiet efficiency in the way she diagnosed a faulty sensor array or rerouted a power coupling. Airman Hayes, a kid barely 20, would sometimes watch her work on the diagnostic panels for the older training jets, his brow furrowed in concentration, as if trying to decipher a complex code. He'd once offered her a lukewarm nutrient bar after a long shift. She'd accepted with a rare, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. It was the closest she'd come to camaraderie in months. Days bled into weeks. Alara learned the Wraith schematics, its maintenance schedules, its every hum and sigh from the outside. She knew its tolerances better than some of the pilots who were cleared to fly it. She'd watched the telemetry during their training flights, her mind running parallel simulations, anticipating their errors, calculating optimal trajectories they consistently missed. The machine was a marvel, yes, but it was also a reflection. It magnified skill, but it also magnified ego, and she saw plenty of the latter from the observation deck. She filed another request for flight evaluation. It came back stamped, "Deferred indefinitely." The ink was a cold, indifferent blue. One afternoon, a complex multi-aircraft training exercise was underway. A sudden squall, unpredicted and violent, swept across the training range. Communications became patchy. One of the younger pilots, flying an older Scythe model, reported spatial disorientation, his voice tight with panic. Maddox in the control tower was barking instructions, his usual composure frayed. Davies, also in the tower, was fumbling with radar displays. Ilara, who had been calibrating a ground approach radar nearby, heard the strained transmissions. Without a word, she stepped into the auxiliary comm station, her fingers flying over the antiquated console. She didn't speak to the pilot. She spoke to the air traffic controllers, her voice calm, devoid of inflection. Vector him to grid 7, 9er, Delta, lowest cloud base there. Give him a wide berth, approach from 030. He's fighting vertigo, not the storm. Her instructions were precise, based on her knowledge of the terrain, the jet's limitations under stress, and the subtle cues in the pilot's ragged breathing she'd picked up. Maddox shot her an irritated look, about to snap, but then he saw the radar track begin to stabilize as the controllers relayed her guidance. The scythe, battered but intact, landed 20 minutes later, the young pilot visibly shaken but safe. Maddox said nothing to her. Colonel Graves, who had entered the tower during the commotion, merely glanced at her, his expression unreadable, before turning his attention back to the debrief. But Airman Hayes, who had witnessed it all from a corner, caught her eye and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod of respect. It was a fleeting acknowledgement, but it settled something within her, a tiny ember in the cold expanse of her current existence. The pressure on the base intensified in the following weeks. Rumors of increased unidentified aerial phenomena along the border sectors had trickled down, creating an undercurrent of unease. The Wraith Squadron, still not fully operational, was pushed harder. More simulators, more drills, more strained expressions. Alara continued her work, a silent, steady presence. She knew the Wraith system so intimately now that she could almost feel its readiness, its potential, thrumming through the hangar floor. She felt a strange protectiveness towards the machines, these beautiful, powerful tools so often entrusted to hands that lacked the deep, almost spiritual connection required to truly unlock their capabilities. Then came the alert. Not a drill. A series of high-speed, unidentified contacts had breached restricted airspace, moving erratically too fast for conventional interceptors, their electronic signatures unlike anything on record. Scrambled scythes were evaded with contemptuous ease. 2 of the Wraith pilots were on emergency leave. The remaining 2, including Davies, were scrambled. Alara watched their telemetry from the ground crew station, her heart a cold, steady beat. Davies, overconfident, pushed his Wraith too hard in a climb, trying to gain a firing solution on a target that seemed to dance just out of reach. He reported a cascade failure in the primary avionics, his voice suddenly very young. The other Wraith pilot, more experienced, managed to engage 1 contact, but was quickly outmaneuvered by 2 others, sustaining minor damage and forced to disengage. The unidentified contacts, now confirmed as a swarm of highly advanced autonomous drones, continued their inexorable advance towards a critical civilian infrastructure hub. Panic began to ripple through the command center. Colonel Graves' face was a mask of controlled fury and dawning desperation. The remaining operational Wraith sat fueled and armed in its bay, a silent promise of power, but with no seasoned pilot available. Maddox looked pale. "Sir, we can't send a rookie up against that. Davies is already down." Thompson barely made it back. He gestured towards the telemetry screens, showing the drone's terrifying agility. "They're learning, adapting. It's like nothing we've ever seen. We need that Wraith in the air," Graves ground out, his voice tight. "Is there anyone at all with advanced systems experience?" His eyes scanned the frantic faces in the room. Alara stepped forward. The movement was small, almost insignificant in the charged atmosphere, yet it drew every eye. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply stated, her tone flat, devoid of emotion but carrying an undeniable weight, "I can fly the Wraith, Colonel." Maddox scoffed, a strangled, incredulous sound. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't a simulator run for ground personnel, this is—" "I am aware of the situation, Instructor." Alara cut him off, her gaze fixed on Graves. Her stillness was absolute, a counterpoint to the chaos around them. Colonel Graves looked at her, truly looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the set of her jaw, the unwavering clarity in her eyes. But he also saw the maintenance overalls, the presumed lack of recent flight hours, the official record that painted her as little more than a competent technician. Doubt warred with the desperation gnawing at him. "Your file shows no recent flight certification for a platform like the XR-9, Alara. This is not the time for—" His voice trailed off, his duty to protect his assets, his people, conflicting with the stark reality of the threat. He was about to dismiss her, to turn away and face the inevitable failure, when she made a subtle, almost unconscious movement. She'd been clenching her fist, and as she relaxed it, she shifted her weight, her head tilting slightly. The movement caused the collar of her overalls, already slightly askew from her earlier work, to dip further, exposing a small, intricate tattoo just below her left ear, at the base of her hairline. It was a creature of the night, a stylized kestrel, wings upswept as if in a perpetual climb. A single, tiny, 5-pointed star etched just above its right wingtip. The ink was faded, old, but the lines were undeniably precise, meaningful. Colonel Graves froze. His mind, trained to recognize insignia, call signs, the subtle markers of elite units, raced. He'd seen something like it before, years ago, in a heavily redacted after-action report. A briefing on a unit so secret its existence was barely a whisper in the highest echelons of command. Project Nightwing. Pilots who flew missions that never officially happened, in machines that technically didn't exist. Legends, ghosts. The kestrel, he remembered, was their unofficial emblem. The star denoted a commander, a flight leader of exceptional skill. His breath caught. He looked from the tattoo back to Alara's face, seeing it now not as the face of a middle-aged ground crew member, but as a vessel of untold experience, of unimaginable burdens borne in silence. The quietude he'd mistaken for passivity was the calm of someone who had faced far worse than a swarm of drones. The hyper-competence with ground systems was not just technical aptitude, it was the ingrained knowledge of a pilot who understood her machine from the inside out. All the pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud of realization. His skepticism, his dismissiveness, the institutional arrogance that had relegated this woman to the shadows, it all crashed down upon him. Maddox, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding in the colonel's mind, started to speak again. "Sir, we can't possibly—" "Silence, Maddox." Graves' voice was a low growl, cutting through the instructor's protest like a blade. He didn't take his eyes off Alara. The entire command center seemed to hold its breath. The only sounds were the urgent beeps of the radar and the increasingly desperate calls from civilian authorities. He saw the faint, almost invisible scars around the tattoo, memories of a life she had tried to leave behind, or perhaps one that had been stripped from her. "Nix," he said, the word a quiet breath, a name dredged from the deepest recesses of classified memory, a call sign associated with the kestrel emblem. Ilara's expression did not change, but for a fraction of a second, her eyes, those calm, deep pools, seemed to flicker with an ancient weariness. And something else, a spark of the fire she had banked for so long. She simply nodded, once, the briefest, most profound acknowledgement. The transformation in Colonel Graves was absolute. The doubt vanished, replaced by a dawning awe and a deep burning shame for his own blindness. He straightened, his voice now crisp, imbued with a new, desperate hope. "Get her to that Wraith, now." He turned to the stunned technicians. "Full systems interface. Give her anything she needs." Maddox stared, mouth agape, as Alara turned without a word and headed for the hangar, her strides purposeful, economical, the strides of someone who knew exactly where she was going and what needed to be done. The hangar doors hissed open, revealing the XR-9 Wraith, gleaming under the sterile lights. It seemed to hum with anticipation, or perhaps that was just the thrum of Alara's own senses, heightened, alive. The ground crew, galvanized by the colonel's urgent command and the sudden, inexplicable shift in authority, moved with a new alacrity. They strapped her in, their movements efficient, almost reverent now. She didn't speak, her focus entirely on the machine around her. Her hands, those hands, they said, were not meant for this, moved over the controls with an intimacy that was breathtaking to witness. It wasn't the hesitant touch of a trainee, nor the aggressive grip of an egotist. It was a communion. She didn't just activate systems, she awakened them. The Wraith's cockpit lights shimmered to life, bathing her face in a soft, ethereal glow. The heads-up display flickered, data streams flowing across her visor. She was no longer Alara, the ground crew technician. She was Nyx, and this was her element. The canopy sealed with a pneumatic hiss, cocooning her in the heart of the machine. The engine spooled up, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through her very bones. It was a song she knew well. She taxied onto the runway, the Wraith moving with a grace that belied its power. Colonel Graves, Maddox, and a crowd of silent, astonished onlookers watched from the control tower. Maddox was ashen-faced, his earlier condescension replaced by a bewildered shock. Graves stood rigid, his gaze fixed on the sleek fighter. Ilara lined up. "Tower, Nix, requesting immediate departure, unrestricted climb." Her voice over the comms was pure signal, no noise. "Nix, Tower, runway is yours. Unrestricted climb approved. Godspeed." The controller's voice was laced with an uncharacteristic humility. With a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the airbase, the Wraith hurtled down the runway. Ilara didn't force the ascent, she allowed it. The aircraft lifted, not with the brute force Davies had displayed, but with an almost organic fluidity, retracting its gear and arcing skyward in a breathtaking vertical climb that seemed to defy gravity. She didn't waste an ounce of energy, a single unnecessary maneuver. The Wraith, in her hands, was not just a machine. It was an extension of her will, a perfectly attuned instrument. She reached altitude in record time, the curvature of the Earth a familiar sight. The drone swarm was a chaotic signature on her tactical display, closing fast on the civilian zone. Her mind processed the data not as a series of threats, but as a complex, multidimensional equation. She didn't charge in. She observed, analyzed their flight patterns, their reactive algorithms. They were fast, agile, their movements designed to overwhelm. But they lacked true sentience, true adaptability beyond their programming. They lacked a soul. "Engaging," she stated, her voice utterly calm. The Wraith danced. It didn't engage in wild dogfights. It flowed through the swarm like water through reeds. Her movements were a symphony of deadly precision. A burst of focused energy fire, precisely aimed, disabled a lead drone's primary guidance. Another maneuver, an impossible slip and roll, drew two drones into a collision course with each other. She used their own aggressive programming against them. She wasn't just shooting them down, she was dismantling their coordinated attack, her Wraith moving with an almost preternatural awareness of their every intent. Each shot was a kill, each evasion a masterpiece of three-dimensional chess. She didn't exult. She didn't waste breath on commentary. She simply worked, a silent, focused whirlwind of skill and steel. The machine responded to her slightest touch, anticipating her needs. The two entities fused into one single lethal predator hunting in its natural element. From the control tower, they watched the telemetry with a mixture of disbelief and awe. The chaotic blips of the enemy drones were vanishing one by one. Maddox, his face pale, muttered, "It's impossible. No one can fly like that." Colonel Graves said nothing. His eyes locked on the display. The image of the kestrel tattoo burned into his mind. He was witnessing not just skill, but artistry, a level of mastery he had only read about in hushed, almost mythical accounts. This was not a pilot, this was a force of nature. The final drone, larger and more heavily armed, attempted a desperate suicidal attack. Ilara didn't flinch. She met it head-on, then, at the last possible microsecond, executed a maneuver so complex, so audacious, that it seemed to bend the laws of physics. The Wraith flipped, presenting its heavily armored underside, simultaneously deploying a micro-burst of countermeasures that confused the drone's targeting. As it overshot, momentarily disoriented, she brought her lasers to bear, a single, precise shot severing its primary power core. The drone exploded silently in the thin air. Silence descended on the comms, broken only by Ilara's even breathing. "Targets neutralized," she reported, her voice as calm as if she were reporting a completed maintenance check. Returning to base. The landing was as flawless as the takeoff. The Wraith taxied to its hangar, its engines winding down with a sigh. The canopy hissed open. Ilara unstrapped, her movements economical, betraying no sign of the immense G-forces she had endured, the incredible mental strain she had been under. She climbed out, the maintenance overalls now seeming like a strange, ill-fitting costume. The ground crew approached, but hesitated, their usual boisterous efficiency replaced by a quiet reverence. Airman Hayes simply stared, his mouth slightly open. She walked across the tarmac towards the command building. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in hues of orange and purple. Colonel Graves and Instructor Maddox were waiting outside. Maddox looked down at his boots, unable to meet her eyes. His arrogance had been utterly dismantled, replaced by a profound, humbling understanding of his own limitations. Graves, however, stood tall, his face etched with a complex mixture of emotions: relief, profound respect, and a deep personal shame for his earlier judgment. As Alara approached, he didn't offer platitudes or apologies. He simply looked at her, truly seeing the quiet strength, the immense depth of experience she carried. He saw the faint lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the only outward sign of the battle she had fought. "Nix," he said, his voice quiet, heavy with unspoken meaning. "Thank you." Alara paused, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, the stoic mask wavered, and he saw a flicker of the immense loneliness, the burden of a past that could never fully be shed. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. No words were necessary. The understanding passed between them, silent and profound. She then continued walking, past him, past the awestruck onlookers, towards the anonymous barracks that had been her solitary refuge. She didn't look back. Colonel Graves watched her go, a lone figure receding into the gathering dusk. He raised a hand, unconsciously, to his own neck, as if feeling for a ghost of an insignia there. The wind picked up again, carrying the distant, now respectful hum of the cooling wraith, and the faint scent of ozone and victory. He knew, with absolute certainty, that things on this airbase would never be the same. The silence she left in her wake was more powerful than any commendation. It was the silence of awe, of respect, hard-earned and deeply felt, the silence of minds irrevocably changed. In the fading light, the kestrel on her neck, though hidden again beneath her collar, seemed to cast a shadow far larger than its wearer. The dust of the base, he realized, no longer clung to her as a sign of her demotion, but as the mark of a guardian who had, once again, taken flight. He saw Maddox finally lift his head, his expression one of dawning humility, and knew the transformation was complete, not just for him, but for all who had witnessed the quiet fury and breathtaking skill of the woman they had so profoundly underestimated. He turned to Maddox, his voice quiet but firm. "See to it that her transfer to the Wraith Squadron is expedited. And Maddox," he added, his gaze unwavering, "ensure her true rank and commendations are reinstated immediately." The institutional arrogance had been shattered, not by a formal complaint, but by the undeniable truth of action.